still smells old. And here are some of the slides. This is Judah triumphing over Messiah. You may come and look at these if you like. Here is the angel, like you can see him, right? And here are the wise men, whatever. Come and see them. You know, kind of, they were an improvement on this. You ever use these? What's this called? Yeah, stereopticon. And you look in, and you see 3D. You really should come and do this. This is a giant temple showing groups of idols from Calcutta, India. Pretty weird. All right, come and enjoy. The Riley Brothers slides sets contain 72 glass slides and a printed narration called an epitome, and came in a long wooden box like the one I just showed you. The first 25 slides were painted by an artist named F.W. Weeks. His pictures tended to be quite ornate, very colorful, and rather dramatic. Let me illustrate the relationship between the art and narration by showing you this one of Weeks' works. It's called The Affrighted Shepherds. A dazzling light appears in the sky, and then the narrator reads from the epitome a direct quote from the novel. Quote, "Awake, awake," cried the terrified man. Up sprang the dogs and ran howling away. The sheep rushed together as if for mutual protection, whilst the affrighted shepherds leapt to their feet and clutched their weapons crying, "What is it? What is it?" Here are 3 more of Weeks' illustration from the Nativity prologue of Ben-Hur. This is the angel that was at the center of all of that light that so frightened the shepherds. Here are the wise men enter Jerusalem asking, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" And here they approach Herod, inquiring after the birth of the Messiah. Weeks' rather elaborate illustrations at the beginning of the series are followed by the somewhat simpler works of a female artist named Natty Preston, who probably painted the rest of the series, beginning with this one, in which Quintus Arius is about to, can't you tell the difference? Is about to board the Trieme as the commander of the ship in which Judah is enslaved as a rower. The Riley slides also include 2 famous paintings by well-known artists. This is Gustav Wagner's iconic The Chariot Race from 1873, and Gustave Doré's Christ Leaving the Presidium from the same year. Now, Madame Lucinda may not have time to tell you about the way the ever-vigilant Henry Lane Wallace, his father's lawyer, and the lawyers for Harper Brothers, the publisher of Ben-Hur, immediately sued the Riley brothers over the unauthorized use of the general's words in the epitome. They also claimed that the Rileys boast that their artists used living Jewish models for the illustrations made it a dramatic production, which violated the contract rights to the tableau vivant version of the novel that had been touring with the general's permission throughout the United States for several years. The plaintiffs prevailed on the first point, but not the second point. And without the epitome, the Riley brothers decided that the series would not sell in America and withdrew it from American production. Let me encourage all of you to come and attend this show, because it's apparently really fascinating. And I'm going to show, there are about 72 slides. I think you're going to see 51 of them tonight. Now, to the subject for tonight's lecture. How my views of Ben-Hur and its adaptation tradition have been changed by the studies focused this year on travel in the life and works of Lew and Sue Wallace. To do this, I'm going to focus on Judah, especially his coming of age and his search for his identity. In particular, I want to tease out the role that travel played in that process. Now, I need to warn you about something. I forgot to do this at the beginning. This is the only place in the world that I feel like I can come and talk about Lew Wallace and Judah Ben-Hur and the novel as if you've all read it. Now, I know that's not true. I don't care. Here we go. According to the general, Ben-Hur had its origins in a travel experience. More precisely, his chance encounter with the great agnostic, Robert Greene Ingersoll, on a train between Indianapolis and Chicago in 1876, possibly in a railroad car like this one. Now, whether that meeting actually took place or not, travel and traveling is a central theme in Wallace's Ben-Hur. A novel that I now see depicts a world in motion and is filled with characters constantly on the move. Many of the sections of the novel read like portions of the travel memoirs that were so popular in the late Victorian period, such as those written by Susan Wallace herself. Like those travel memoirs, Ben-Hur is filled with detailed descriptions of people, places, and social and cultural mores that were utterly foreign to most Americans in the late 19th century. These sometimes unrelenting and tedious details are among the many things that make Ben-Hur so inaccessible to the modern reader. I shall never forget when I tried to get my oldest of my 5 sisters to read Ben-Hur. She tried to read it for a few pages, and she said, "Howard, I love you. I don't love you that much." But 19th century readers clearly couldn't get enough of the book's description of exotic people, places, and things. In fact, I suspect that the travelogue aspects of the novel go a long way to explain its unprecedented and long-lived success. It is an exhaustive armchair guide to the Holy Land. And those detailed descriptions are important for another reason. By the time Wallace published Ben-Hur in 1880, Americans had begun to read memoirs of notable Americans about their foreign travels in general and the Holy Land in particular. By 1880, Americans had already read travel memoirs by William H. Seward, Charles Dudley Warner, and most notably, Mark Twain. Despite the often irreverent tones of especially Warner and Twain's work, most Americans, I sense, accepted that what the travelers reported as accurate, and that is to say, true. They accepted as accurate and true what they reported. When Wallace published Ben-Hur in 1880, he had himself never traveled to the Near East. And I kind of think he never quite got over that. But he spent years in the Library of Congress, the Boston Public Library, and in his own already extensive and always growing collection. In other words, he became an armchair traveler, writing for potential armchair tourists. To illustrate the detailed nature of his research, here are some of the notes that he made about the ancient city of Antioch and its celebrated Grove of Daphne, to which we will return in just a moment. Now, I have always suspected that Lew Wallace accepted President Garfield's appointment to the Ottoman Empire as American ambassador because he would finally be able to travel to Antioch and Jerusalem himself and test the accuracy of his descriptions of at least the topography of the region. And as you know, I hope from reading the text of the current exhibit, he was quite pleased with what he saw. He pronounced a little smugly, "I found the descriptive details true to the existing objects and scenes, and I find no reason for making a single change in the text of the book." He all but said, "And here is the stone that Judah Ben-Hur sat on." Actually, he may say exactly that. And Americans seem to agree. They found the detailed descriptions of people and places of the novel so impressively realistic that they assumed that they were accurate. It was but another step to assume that the general's tale of the Christ was also accurate. And that is to say, true, not only to the life of Wallace's fictional hero, but of the early life and the ministry of the Son of God himself. Americans quickly came to believe that Wallace's story of Jesus giving the enslaved Judah water to drink from the well at Nazareth actually occurred and was in the gospel. I'm serious. And that Judah Ben-Hur was in fact the young man who ran away naked to escape being seized with Jesus and his disciples by the Roman guards in the Garden of Gethsemane. Little wonder then that Americans came to think of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, as the fifth gospel. And mostly, that was a wonderful call and response. Mostly, I believe, because of the general's carefully researched and detailed descriptions of the land in which the Nazarene lived and died. So, with that background, let me now make a few general observations about travel and travelers in Ben-Hur, some of which I never noticed until this year's emphasis on travel. This has really made a difference in the way I view the novel and its adaptation series. For instance, just one example. In the normal course of events, Travelers are free to move of their own volition, right? You can get people to even tell you how to do it, but you can decide where you're going to go. To be able to control one's own movements is one of the most precious of human freedoms. But the members of the Hur family lose that freedom early in the novel. You will remember that as the result of what Wallace calls the accident to gratis, the members of the Hur family become condemned prisoners. Sentenced without trial to die at the oars of a Roman galley, the enslaved Judah travels all over the Mediterranean. But the miserable man can never leave his stillborn prison. Here he is going everywhere, he can't leave. And he has no control over his movements, and he never knows where he is or where he's going. I've never thought about that before. Of course, the fate of the mother and sister of Judah is even more horrible, because they were imprisoned, immured in a tiny leprosy-infected cell in the Fortress Antonia in Jerusalem, there to await an invisible but certain death. Now, I suspect that Lew Wallace did not intend this, but I have noticed a remarkable thing about the reaction of the doomed Hur family to this catastrophe because of this emphasis on travel. The three captives find ways, mother, daughter, Judah, find ways to compensate in varying degrees for their loss of freedom of movement. And they do so by using the only thing that has been left to them, the natural world. More especially, the sun and the stars. In fact, stars, which have always been trustworthy guides to travel both through time and space, are very important in Ben-Hur. Remember that the novel begins with a divinely appointed star that appears to each one of the wise men in India, this is India, Greece, and Egypt, and then guides them to Bethlehem. What is the sun? A star. The sun is our star. Remember that. So let's first look at Judah and his relationship to the stars. In the 3 years that he was chained to the oar in a Roman galley, Judah was allowed onto the deck of the trireme only once, when the intrigued Quintus Arrius interviewed the unusual slave. But Wallace tells us that Judah's seat in the galley was directly under a grate through which Ben-Hur could feel the warmth of the stars during the day. You can just see the little top of it up there. During the day, and could see at night the radiant stars, the sailor's compass. The Judean quickly learned that one of his biggest problems in being in prison and traveling on a ship was not knowing where he was going and where the ship was going. Judah was always aware that the ship was, quote, gliding swiftly along some of the many tracks of the sea. And the man longed, quote, to know where he was and whither going. He found himself looking into the grate and the small part of the sky to which it gave him access. By watching the shifting of the meager sunbeams over the cabin floor by day and the location of the stars at night, he came to know generally the part of the Mediterranean into which he was sailing, and he really did, apparently. This ability to locate himself gave Judah the courage and the strength to persevere in the face of the never-ending tedium and occasional bursts of chaos and panic that were the lot of a Roman galley slave. And what of his imprisoned mother and sister in Jerusalem? The only opening in their tiny jail cell was a single slit high in one exterior wall. But through that small aperture, the rising sun, the star closest to the earth, every day cast, quote, a faint but friendly ray of light. The mother talks about it just almost as if it's part of her family, the friendly ray of light. The ray of light shifted as the earth moved around the sun, marking also the progress of time of day. Note, the stars charted space for Judah, it marked time for his mother and sister. In that ray of light, Tirzah and her mother daily left their cell and walked abroad in the world, free women. Hear how the general describes it, using the language of motion, movement, travel. Quote, through that crevice as if it were broad and high as a king's gate. They went to the world in thought and passed the weary time going up and down as spirits go, looking and asking, the one for her son, the other for her brother. On the seas they sought him, and on the islands of the seas. Today he was in this city, tomorrow in that, and everywhere and at all times he was a fleeting sojourner. For as they lived waiting for him, he lived watching for them. As the condemned Hur family do as best they can to survive, the other characters in Wallace's novel are constantly in motion, on the road. So let's turn now to them. I have commented from this pulpit before that Ben-Hur is a very unusual Victorian novel because the novel contains almost no intact nuclear family. Guess what the only intact nuclear family is? The Holy Family. Thank you very much. The book features, follow me, the book features two fathers, Balthazar and Simonides, who raised daughters without mothers. We know virtually nothing of Messala's father, let alone his mother. Sheik-Ilderim, whom we will meet, has more wives than horses. And we do not hear anything about his children until the last pages of the novel. That's very strange. And it's certainly not Victorian. Little surprise then that there are virtually no permanent homes in Ben-Hur. And that after the Hur family is separated, we meet every major character either in exile or in temporary quarters or on the road, traveling in one way or another. Remember those lectures I gave about travel, about the adaptation series? I was always focusing on homecoming and the centrality of the Ben-Hur home in the adaptation history. Caused me to forget just how little of the novel actually takes place in anybody's home, and how much of it is spent in motion, on the road, on journeys, on traveling. And one of the greatest attractions of traveling and of touring is going home. But what if there are no homes to go home to? Very interesting. Think about it. No one in this novel is ever at home. The novel begins with Mary and Joseph journeying to Bethlehem. We see them then in their first home, a very temporary home, a cave. The three wise men have all left their homes. We first see them in a tent in the middle of the desert. When we first meet Simonides, the steward of the Hur family, and his daughter Esther, they are in Antioch in virtual exile from the Hur palace in Jerusalem, which is now deserted except for the faithful Egyptian servant Amra, who in hiding keeps watch over the ruins of domesticity in that palace. Amra is in fact the only character who remains in her home throughout the novel. Those other Egyptians are, in effect, Balthazar and his daughter Iris, are in effect wanderers, driven to travel anywhere that Balthazar, one of the three wise men's mission to find and serve the Holy Child, directs him. And Sheik-Ilderim, he is literally a nomad and carries his home with him. His home is wherever he pitches his tent. Focusing on travel also allowed me to notice for the first time just how much of the relationship between Iris, the daughter of Balthazar, and Judah develops on the road. He meets the Egyptians in Messala when the reckless Roman almost runs down the Egyptians at the Fount of Castelia in Antioch. The Egyptians are guests of the sheik at the Orchard of Palms outside the city, where Iris and Judah take a turn on the lake in the great oasis in a boat that Iris, like Scheherazade, turns into a magic carpet by the wondrous stories she tells the smitten and then infatuated Ben-Hur. Later in the novel, as the characters journey from Antioch to Jerusalem, Judah travels with the Egyptians, and in a sort of oasis rest stop on the road, Iris tightens her grip on Judah ever more firmly with still more marvelous tales. Then, under the stars in the desert, when both Judah and Iris take their ease by leaning against the great white camel, the Egyptian further enchants and intrigues the young man. And by the time the party arrives in Jerusalem, Judah is completely under the temptress's spell. Now, one of the greatest things about this slide series is that camel. Yeah. This is a cute camel, and he's always cute. One doesn't usually think about camels as cute because they're not, but we got here cute camels. Now, in the midst of all this purposeful, intentional traveling, which I define simply as getting from one place to another, Wallace at one point turns Judah Ben-Hur into a for-real tourist. And I'm going to define tourist as someone who travels to a destination with the intention of exploring it on its own terms. But in order to discuss that, if you'll bear with me, I need for a moment just to take us back to the scene in the novel and in these slides when we first meet Judah and Messala, his former boyhood friend, the Roman. We first see the young men together with the 19-year-old, when the 19-year-old Messala returns to Jerusalem, his boyhood home, and to his boyhood friend, the 17-year-old Judah, the Prince of Hur. Note their ages. These are just kids. 19 and 17, that's actually important in the adaptation's history. The reunited friends quickly get around to discussing Judah's future. The conversation soon becomes heated as a self-consciously urbane Roman pagan urges his friend to leave the confines of his narrow and provincial Jewish heritage and education and embrace the opportunities afforded by serving the far-flung Roman Empire as a soldier, as he, Messala, does. Confused, insulted, and humiliated, Judah first tries to find comfort with his boyhood nurse, Amra, and then to seek the advice of his mother, who, by the way, in the novel is simply called the Princess of Hur. She has no name, till she becomes Miriam in the 1959 film. Aware of her responsibilities as both mother and father, single mom, to her only son, the mother lays out for young Judah the ways in which his Jewish heritage is in fact more ancient and heroic than that of the Romans' identity. Having had his Jewish identity affirmed and celebrated, Judah is almost immediately then torn from his home and past and becomes an involuntary traveler. He is set up on an adventure that will eventually take him to Rome, where, far from home and as the adopted son of the wealthy and powerful Quintus Arrius, he is exposed to the culture and experiences in Rome of which Messala had boasted and had made the young Roman the proud and arrogant man he was. Let me say that again. By betraying Judah and sending him to the galleys, Messala sets Judah on the path to do exactly what Messala had just urged his friend to do, to broaden his horizons and by becoming a Roman soldier. Hold that in mind. Lew Wallace's Tale of the Christ is a classic coming-of-age story, what the Germans call ein Bildungsroman. One of the most common devices in such a tale is to have the hero wrenched from the security of his home and set up on a journey of challenges and trials that leads to self-awareness and self-definition. The best coming-of-age stories almost always involve travel, usually very arduous and challenging travel. The adaptation tradition of Ben-Hur, a story that covers 11 years, does a very poor job of handling this coming-of-age dimension of the novel. It requires the person playing the male lead to age 11 years. It's hard to do. Excuse me. All right. Why? That's partly because the adapters almost always pick an actor to play Judah who is, like the 37-year-old Charlton Heston, too old to be persuasive as a 17-year-old Naif, or too slight and delicate, like 26-year-old Ramon Navarro in the silent movie, to be a convincing adult avenger and nemesis. When I first saw this, I thought, wow. Not my idea of Judah Ben-Hur. And it certainly would have been the generals. A more important reason why the adaptation tradition fails to develop the coming-of-age aspect of Ben-Hur is that those adaptations omit almost entirely several crucial episodes in which Judah grapples with his understanding of himself and his identity, first as a Jew and then as a Roman. And it fundamentally alters a significant aspect of the story of the chariot race, the most memorable episode in the novel. So now let's turn to Judah's search for identity. As we have just seen, the story of Judah Ben-Hur begins with Judah debating with Messala the issue of the boy's identity and his sense of himself as a Jew. Then the tribune Quintus Arrius interrogates the young man about his Jewish heritage. The novel follows Judah to Rome, where he is adopted by Arrius, but we learn from the novel almost nothing about the life of the two men while they were there. The two movies, of course, focused very much on Rome as corrupt and corrupting, but not Lew Wallace. 19th century Americans had long looked upon Rome and its empire as one of the sources of the classical virtues that were central to the American experiment in representative government. In Ben-Hur, Lew Wallace suggests that, far from corrupting the lands it conquered, Rome had herself been corrupted, first of all by Greece, then Egypt, and finally, and most important of all, by the great city Antioch. So it is that we skip in the novel from the adoption of Judah by Arrius in Rome directly to Antioch. And it is in that corrupt and corrupting eastern metropolis that Judah is tempted like Adam in a lovely, lush garden. The temptation is the first of the episodes that soon disappears from the adaptation tradition. Judah arrives in Antioch as part of the military entourage of a Roman consul. He arrives as a soldier. While in the eastern city, Ben-Hur seeks out Simonides, the exiled steward of the house of Hur, and confronts the old man, who we must remember is actually Judah's property. He also meets the steward's daughter, Esther, for the first time. For reasons that need not detain us here, that initial meeting does not go well, and Judah leaves the home of the old merchant convinced, mistakenly as it turns out, that Simonides does not believe him. Well, he does. In fact, the delighted old man recognized Judah immediately as the prince of Hur. But he's going to test him first. After he leaves the house of Simonides, the dejected Judah asks for sightseeing tips from the keeper of the khan at which he was staying. He decides to become a tourist. The helpful man immediately praised the glories of the Grove of Daphne, the large park-like arena area just outside the city that was dedicated to the worship of the god Apollo, which was famous throughout the Mediterranean world for casting a spell over those who ventured into its verdant depths. And this is where Judah Ben-Hur, as he wrestles with his self-identity, becomes a tourist, or as Wallace calls it in his chapter, a sightseer. That's going to be the first time you've seen sightseer, I bet, in English literature. Now, I'm fairly certain that despite his considerable research, both in libraries and his own study, Lew Wallace didn't have a clue about the sightseeing habits of a Roman patrician. But he did know how wealthy Victorians deported himself while traveling for pleasure and edification. And that is how Wallace now describes Judah in the Grove of Daphne as a late Victorian tourist. Here we go. Judah hadn't planned this little excursion to the grove. He didn't have a travel agent. It was an uncharacteristically spontaneous act on the part of Judah. That fact seems to be important to Wallace. Lew says, in ordinary mood, Ben-Hur would not have come to the grove alone, or coming alone, he would have availed himself of his position in the consul's family, used his influence, and made provision against wandering idly about, unknowing and unknown. He would have had all points of interest in mind and gone to them under guidance, as in the dispatch of busyness. Or if he wanted to squander a day of leisure in the beautiful place, he would have had in hand a letter to the master of it all, whoever it might be. Use his influence, throw his weight around. In other words, he would have been traveling very much like the financially secure and thoroughly credentialed Lou and Sue Wallace and their like traveled. You know, I've been waiting for that damn train to come by and hoot so I can drink my water, but I'm going to have to do it without it. Why don't you all fan me? Okay, thanks. Stop. Making me seasick. Although he had heard very much about the charms of the sight, in his wretchedness of feeling, the young man gazed upon the grove with indifference, according to Wallace. Lou tells us, to say the truth, besides his self-absorption, he had not a little of the complacency of a Roman visiting the provinces. It was not possible for the provinces to offer anything new or superior to a Roman. One of the things that I'm learning with all this travel stuff is that Judah Ben-Hur becomes more of a Roman in the novel than the adaptation has us to understand. Apparently, at least a little of Messala's jaded cosmopolitanism had rubbed off on Judah during his 5 years in Rome. And it's in these kinds of instances you find out just how much of a Roman he had become. For a while, Judah wandered among the grove, observing young people in various stages of undress, diverting themselves in all manner of ways. And slowly, the young man felt himself succumbing to the legendary charms of the pagan temple, longing to forget the dreadful calamities that had just befallen him and his family. Now, to tell the truth, Wallace's Grove of Daphne does not seem to have been a particularly licentious sort of place. And it doesn't occur anywhere in the adaptation series history except in this slide series. And I suspect, I'm sorry. It's not this is in the stage play. It's in the stage play. I suspect that the producers of the stage version of Ben-Hur included it only because it gave them an opportunity to stage a ballet. And as you can see, these people are more than fully clothed. But Lou has them seem like they're all just running around naked, doing horrible things to each other. But something about the sensuality of the place began to repel Judah. Wallace tells us, by and by his Jewish nature began to stir within him, and he recalled himself to his duty to find his mother and sister. God of Israel, he cried aloud, springing to his feet with burning cheeks. Mother, Tirzah, cursed be the moment, cursed the place in which I find myself, happy in your loss. All right. There's something about going to this recreational place that had recalled him to his Jewish identity. Now, what was that Jewish identity? In the early chapters of the novel, we learn that Judah's father, 10 years dead when the novel begins, Ithamar, was a Sadducee, who were among the more moderate and less rigid of the children of Abraham. His years in Rome, Judah's years in Rome, apparently inclined the son of Ithamar even to more tolerance and moderation. Hear Wallace on the subject. Quote, a certain facility of accommodation in the matter of religion comes to us after much intercourse with people of a different faith. Gradually we attain the truth that every creed is illustrated by good men who are entitled to our respect, but whom we cannot respect without courtesy to their creed. To this point Ben-Hur had arrived. Neither the years in Rome nor those in the Galley had made impressions upon his faith. He was yet a Jew. In his view, nevertheless, it was not an impiety to look for the beautiful in the Grove of Daphne. But as it happened, looking at that grove, that impiety had brought Judah to the limits of his toleration, and he called the young man back to his father, the faith of his father, and to his duties incumbent on finding his mother and sister. Wallace's tourist leaves the Grove of Daphne, quote, walking with a quicker step, holding his head higher, and while not less sensitive to the delightfulness of all about him, he made his survey with a calmer spirit, though sometimes with curling lip. That is to say, he could not soon forget how nearly he himself had been imposed upon. Okay? Judah's temptation in the Grove of Daphne disappears almost immediately in the adaptation tradition. But it is a significant chapter in the young man's search for his identity. Now, Judah's temptation in the grove was followed almost immediately by the events that led to the great chariot race. Now, most of us think, now I'm going to tell you about how Wallace changes one important aspect of the adaptations tradition's view of the chariot race and who's the bad guy in it. Most of us think of Messala as the bad guy in that race because we think perhaps of Francis X. Bushman's slightly crazed portrayal of Messala by the way, he was 43 at this time, in the silent film. Or more likely, we have in mind Stephen Boyd's much more complicated Messala in the 1959 film, as he pulls one dastardly deed after another in his obsession with winning the race. For instance, he drives a Greek chariot with blades of iron on its wheels. He forces his horses into the chariots of the other drivers. He takes his whip first to Judah's horses and then to his opponent himself. What's not to hate about that? Now, to be sure, there is some of that dastardly Messala in the novel also. But in Wallace's telling of the story of the great race, Roman-trained Judah Ben-Hur plots against his enemy as a relentless Roman general would. He insists repeatedly that revenge is allowed to a Jew. Keep that in mind. He tells Moloch, his servant, or Simonides' servant, that he does not wish Messala to have any advantage over him, and dispatches Moloch to determine the precise height of Messala's chariot. He then tells the servant to position himself at a certain point in the stands, because he's going to see something there. At a predetermined point in the race, Judah would maneuver the brace of his chariot under Messala's chariot, which would cause the Roman to crash, crippling Messala for life. Or he could also have been killed. But that obviously did not deter Wallace's Judah, whose thoroughly orchestrated triumph over Messala was a completely Roman one. Like the temptation in the grove, this part of the chariot race very quickly disappears in the adaptation tradition, where, as I have said, all of the cold-blooded calculation belongs to Messala. Got it? You understand that? It's really Judah who is the bad guy. You know, well, Messala's no, but anyhow, Judah has a little bit. Anyhow, shut up, Howard. In Wallace's telling of Judah's thrilling triumph over Messala in the race, the Roman is severely injured but not killed. Did you know that? I hope you all knew that. In other words, in the novel, Messala does not disappear as an actor with his defeat in the chariot race. Moreover, Iris, who believed that the Roman would easily defeat Judah, deserted her father Balthazar before the race and allied herself with Messala. I'm going to do that again. Moreover, Iris, who believed that the Roman would easily defeat Judah, deserted her father Balthazar before the race and allied herself with Messala, in the hope that he would finally take her to Rome, which is what she wanted to do above all else, and stop traveling with her father, following that stupid star and looking for the man Jesus. And so this leads us to the next incident, which involves Judah's coming of age and sorting out his identity, and which also quickly disappears from the adaptation tradition. Now, But by way of introducing that incident, I'm going to ask you a question. What if Judah Ben-Hur had been trained not as a charioteer, but as a gladiator? Would that make a difference in our response to him? Consider this possible plot of a story. What if a young man was betrayed by a close friend, was illegally sent into slavery, became a famous gladiator, and then defeated his betrayer in a great arena before multitudes? Have you heard that story? Where? Gladiator. Ridley Scott's Gladiator. A film that was about, in the words of its PR, I love this, it's about the general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who defied an emperor. Scott tells us the story of two young men, Commodus and Maximus. Commodus is the son and heir of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and is insanely jealous of Maximus, the emperor's favorite general. Commodus conspires with others to have Maximus sold into slavery. But as I hope you know, Maximus becomes the most famous gladiator of his day. And in the final scenes of the movie, defeats and kills Commodus in a rigged gladiatorial contest that was supposed to result in the death of Maximus, but doesn't. The similarities between the two movies are striking, and I often called Gladiator Ben-Hur without Christians. But some of you who have read the novel might be thinking, hey, Howard, Judah Ben-Hur was trained in gladiatorial combat in Rome. Did you know that? Okay. In fact, in the novel, gladiatorial training and the use of weapons in close personal combat figures much more prominently than Judah's training with a chariot and four. I mean, it's very obvious that he is really a gladiator when he comes back. In fact, it never tells you exactly how he became a charioteer. His gladiatorial teacher was a gruff and bluff barbarian called Thord the Northman. The novel contains not one but two important scenes in which the Roman-trained Judah Ben-Hur, gladiatorial trained Judah Ben-Hur, challenges a Roman not on the racetrack, but in close hand-to-hand gladiatorial combat. These scenes disappear immediately and utterly from the adaptation tradition. They are in none of them after the Magic Lantern show. See in a minute. We'll see it in a minute. So let's now turn to the first of those forgotten gladiatorial incidents. After the chariot race, the crippled and potentially destitute Messala and the now panicked Eris, who realizes too late that she picked the wrong guy, conspire to lure Judah to the palace of Edirne, where he was to be murdered by two gladiators from Rome. They hoped that by killing Judah Ben-Hur, the great fortune that Messala had lost on the bet against Judah in the race would somehow be forgiven. I never quite figured that one out. The palace to which Judah has been invited by Eris is owned by Messala, but is being rented by the Egyptians, Balthazar and his daughter, Eris. Judah, of course, knows none of this. And by this time, he is hopelessly infatuated with the Egyptian. The infatuated and unarmed Judah falls into the trap and arrives at the gorgeous palace, only to find not Eris, but an empty residence. As he enters the front door that opens silently, for him, he notices that the entrance to the palace is Egyptian in style and decoration, but that its interior is distinctly Roman. Still sensing no danger and off his guard, Judah begins to be once a tourist. He kind of tours the interior of the palace, which the reader now sees through the eyes of the educated and cultured Roman that Judah Ben-Hur has become in Rome. As time passes, Judah becomes more and more suspicious about the invitation. He's such a clod. I mean, he just really shouldn't. Then his knowledge of art and decoration kicks in. He connects the fact that the palace is decorated in a combination of Roman and Egyptian. Judah then finally understands, that Eris has collided with Messala and that he has fallen into their hands defenseless. But even without weapons, the the young man is not defenseless. He has his hands, his arms. Where do those arms come from? Rowing. Where does the balance come from? Fighting the sea, okay? That's one of the things that Masala did for him. Sent him to the sand, man, he beefed up real good. So, he's not defenseless. When the two assassins finally appear in the empty palace, Judah instantly recognizes Thor the Northman. Didn't see that one coming, did you? The other one is a younger man who bears a striking resemblance to Judah Ben-Hur. Thinking swiftly, Judah identifies himself to Thor as one of Thor's students and offers to fight the younger man to the death to prove it, which he does, proceeds to do before the delighted and entertained Thor. Judah quickly kills his opponent with his bare hands by using moves that Thor taught him. Then he pays the Northman enough money to buy a wine shop in Rome. And for that, Thor agrees to spread it abroad that the dead man in Judah, that the dead man in the palace is Judah Ben-Hur. He's dead. So that would allow Judah to slip away to the desert, there to join with the Sheik and Simonides to train legions to overthrow Rome, a plan that they had concocted in the Orchard of Palms. Wallace gives the reader no indication whatever that Ben-Hur had any compunction at all about killing another human being, essentially for sport, on a wager, for the entertainment of his old teacher. He operates in the palace of Edirne according to the cold-blooded and ruthless code of the gladiator. The second gladiatorial incident, which also disappears from the adaptation tradition, also illustrates the importance of Judah's travels and the knowledge and experience that they gave him. But unlike the incident in the palace of Edirne, this one occurs not in Antioch but in Jerusalem, when late in the novel Judah returns to the city of his father. So let's follow Judah to Jerusalem. He goes there to search for his imprisoned mother and sister. And as you know, the women had been imprisoned in a leprous cell in the fortress of Antonia in the Holy City. When Pontius Pilate became the governor of Judea, he made a thorough search of the entire prison system for the first time in years. The women were discovered. They were discovered as lepers and were hurriedly released. As they made their way to the valley of lepers outside the city, they stopped under the cover of darkness at their old home. As happens only in fiction, their visit coincided with Judah's return to the palace, and there he's laying asleep. They discovered Judah asleep at the gate of their derelict home, and in perhaps the most poignant scene in the novel. The women forced themselves to refrain from awakening or even the touching the body of the young man. The mother piteously caresses her son's shadow, while Tirzah lightly kisses Ben-Hur's sandal. They are later discovered by the faithful servant Amra, who thereafter brings them food in the valley of the lepers. All of these heartbreaking events are found in virtually all of the adaptations of the novel. I assume you've seen them caressing and all that kind of stuff. Okay. But people who know Ben-Hur only from that adaptation tradition will not know that in the General's Tale of the Christ, Judah Ben-Hur for 3 years became something of a disciple of Jesus Christ. He kind of became the 13th disciple and followed the miracle-working Nazarene and his disciples throughout Judea through Jesus' ministry. In fact, Judah's interest in the man who many believed to be the long-promised Messiah, who would overthrow the Romans and establish his rule in Jerusalem, may have been in part one of the ways in which Ben-Hur reasserted his Jewish identity after the temptation scene in the Grove of Daphne. Thus it was that Judah, in the presence of Balthasar and Iris and that beautiful camel, was on the banks of the Jordan when John the Baptist declared Jesus of Nazareth not to be the Messiah, but the Son of God, who would not rule the Jews but redeem all of mankind. Fired with enthusiasm, Judah followed Jesus and his disciples from afar for 3 years. In a long chapter in the novel, Judah becomes an evangelist for the Nazarene and reports his miraculous ministry to his family, including Simonides and Esther, Balthazar and Eros, and the faithful Amra she hears about. At one point, Judah reports that Jesus miraculously healed not 1 but 10 lepers. Immediately, Amra resolves to take her mistress and the dying Tirzah to the Nazarene to be healed. And that is exactly what happens as Judah Ben-Hur looks on in amazement. After Judah embraced the healed women, he took off his outer tunic and put it around his sister's shoulders, which exposed the sword at his waist. His confused mother looked surprised and asked, "Is this a time of war?" Judah then was forced to tell his mother that for 3 years, in addition to following the ministry of Jesus, he also had been training 2 legions of Galileans to defend the Nazarene if necessary. A soldier. Think about it. Judah returns to Jerusalem as a Roman soldier, exactly the future that Messiah had urged upon him 8 years ago in that fated last meeting of the boyhood friends. But he now uses his military training to oppose Rome. In Jerusalem, Judah quickly became involved with a group of Galileans who were plotting a rebellion against an enlarged Roman garrison there. Because of his Roman military history and experience, Ben-Hur assumed command of the Galileans immediately, organized them into cohorts and legions, and armed them with tree branches. When it became known that Pilate was going to use his sacred temple funds or korban, to build a new aqueduct, the men of Galilee, led by the Roman-trained Prince of Hur, rose in rebellion. In the ensuing battle, Wallace tells us, no one had performed his part as well as Ben-Hur, whose training served him admirably. For not merely he knew to strike and guard, his long arms, perfect action, and incomparable strength helped him also to success in every encounter. He was at the same time fighting man and leader. He seemed, moreover, to have eyes for each combat of his friends, and the faculty of being at the right time, exactly at the right moment, exactly where he was most needed. In his fighting cry, there was inspiration for his party and alarm for his enemies. Thus surprised and equally matched, the Romans at first retired, but finally turned on their backs and fled to the portico. The impetuous Galileans would have pursued them to the steps, but Ben-Hur wisely restrained them. Now, Judah's confident, even cocky leadership of the Galileans impressed the leader of the Roman forces so much that the intrigued centurion in charge of the Roman cohort challenged the stranger to man-to-man combat. "Ho, insolent!" the Roman called. "Art thou a Roman or a Jew?" Putting the question of identity directly to Judah. Ben-Hur answered, "I am a son of Judah, Ben-Hur." The supremely confident Judah readily accepted the challenge. And as he did, he said, "What I didn't tell you is that I'm a gladiator." And using more of his gladiatorial training, quickly and efficiently dispatched the Roman, to the delight of the multitude, just like to the delight of Thord, that witnessed the contest. Judah, having already killed one Roman in a contest to save his own life, now killed another, essentially for sport. Now, one of my clearest memories is of my reaction to listening. I never read Ben-Hur. I listened to the audio version of Ben-Hur. And my shock at how cold-blooded and calculating Judah was as he planned and executed his revenge on his friend-turned-betrayer Messiah and other Romans. And I've always wondered why late Victorian Americans, especially the clergy, did not notice and object to it. Well, it turned out that they did. Earlier this year, one of the readers of a growing international community of Wallace Ben-Hur scholars, a friend named Barbara Ryan, published a study of the reception of Ben-Hur and its adaptations from 1880 through 1924, when the silent cinematic adaptation was released. Barbara is an American and teaches American Studies at the National University of Singapore. I've told you on several occasions, one of the most exciting things happening right now in our field is that a growing international community of scholars are looking at Ben-Hur from the perspectives of their own varied disciplines. Her book is entitled Chronicling Ben-Hur's Climb. Among other things, Barbara tries to explain the fact that Ben-Hur did not become an overnight bestseller. There was about 4 or 5 years before it did. She argues that one of the reasons for that was because many Americans, especially the Protestant clergy, had reservations about the behavior of Judah Ben-Hur and exactly the episodes we have discussed tonight. Barbara is a real internet wizard at research. She can find any newspaper in the world. So she has read literally hundreds of early reviews of the novel. She found out that a substantial minority of critics, minority by the way, especially Protestant ministers, thought that until the very end of the novel, in his coming of age search for identity as a Jew and a Roman, Judah Ben-Hur was not a proper role model for Christians. They objected to the centrality of the vengeance theme in the novel. They did not approve of the calculated way in which Judah prepared to defeat Messiah in the chariot race and criticized his indifference to the possibilities that his former friend could easily be killed. They objected to the gladiatorial theme because of its association with cruelty and blood sport, and because gladiators, even in the late 19th century, were associated with the persecution of the early church. In what came to be called the Neronian persecutions, gladiators fought in the Colosseum. You know the old thumbs up, you live, thumbs down, you die. So they have the gladiators fight, and then what happens? Christians get fed to the lions. Not good company. Gladiators, boo. The ministers also were appalled by the casual way in which at the palace of Edirne, Judah killed a perfect stranger, essentially to entertain his gladiatorial teacher. And they especially objected when, after leading the Galileans to victory over the Roman cohort in Jerusalem, Judah arrogantly, even defiantly, accepted the centurion's challenge to mortal hand-to-hand combat. Barbara argues, not always convincingly, that those primarily clerical objections for a few years dampened the original public response to the general's tale of the Christ. Whether this is true or not, and I kind of think it's not, it is undeniably the case that those elements of the novel to which the ministers objected almost immediately disappeared from the adaptations of Ben-Hur that began in the late 19th century. That transformation, in fact, began with the Riley Brothers Magic Lantern show itself. The narration that accompanies this slide, the overthrow of Messiah, for instance, did not quote directly from the novel like almost all of the others do. Instead, in its own words, it attributed Ben-Hur's victory in the chariot race to the extraordinary way in which Judah bonded with the sheik's 4 horses. There is no mention of Judah's skillful and well-practiced maneuvers that intentionally upended the Romans' chariot. In similar fashion, after a brief appearance in the silent film, Judah's Galilean legions disappear altogether from the adaptation tradition, as do all of Ben-Hur's gladiatorial triumphs. Charlton Heston doesn't do any of that stuff. So what's going on? Gradually, in the adaptations of Ben-Hur after the Magic Lantern show, Judah emerges as neither Jewish nor Roman, but as a proto-Christian. A Christian, we know he's going to be a Christian from the very beginning. And that's a problem. Why? Lew Wallace was at great pains to show that Judah very carefully protected his basic Jewish identity as he trained in the martial arts under a series of Roman instructors like Thor the Northman, in order to have his very Jewish revenge over Rome in general and Messala in particular. Luke also shows very clearly just how much of a Roman Judah became in that process. But in the adaptations of Ben-Hur, that process of becoming Roman almost completely disappears. Now, some of you may remember that my first lecture about the adaptation of tradition of Ben-Hur, 2 years ago, I think, maybe 3, was on the theme of conversion in Ben-Hur. In that lecture, I did not focus on Ben-Hur as a coming-of-age novel at all. But I did discuss the ways in which Wallace uses Judah's struggles with both his Jewish heritage and his Roman training as a way of making even more dramatic the power of his conversion to Christianity. He had a lot to overcome. Barbara Ryan's Victorian ministers do not seem to recognize the power of that narrative strategy. They forget that Wallace's hero does not become a Christian until the end of the novel, the very end of the novel. He is a practicing Jew with Roman education and serious martial experience. Every failing for which the ministers criticize Wallace's pre-conversion hero enhances enormously the power of his conversion. The sequential adaptations of Ben-Hur slowly turn Judah into the proto-Christian throughout the novel that the Victorian ministers wanted him to be. Got it? In fact, some of you may remember that in my last lecture on the adaptation tradition, we saw that even Messala finally got redeemed. Everyone's a Christian. However, none of that changes the reality of the fact of Wallace's much more complex and complicated hero, who is in no way a proto-Christian throughout the novel. How many of you have seen the 1959 film? All right. Remember that stairwell that I said was the center of their home? Mm-hmm. All kinds of wonderful things happen. Okay, one of those stairwell scenes. Okay. In the 1959 film, Judah, a.k.a. Charlton Heston, hardens his heart against Messala and rejects the appeals of Esther and Balthazar to forgive Messala. But then Judah is finally converted at the foot of the cross by the way in which Jesus died, asking his Father to forgive his persecutors. When Judah returns to his home and that stairwell, after the crucifixion, he tells Esther, almost in a trance, or what passes for a trance in Charlton Heston's acting lexicon, that at the moment of his dying, Jesus took the sword away from me. What is wrong with that picture? We don't ever see a sword in the hands of Charlton Heston. In the novel, the martial training is a continuing focus. By ignoring that fact, the adaptation history diminishes the power of Judah's conversion to a belief in the Nazarene's gospel of forgiveness and love. Now, you've been waiting for this sentence. Let me conclude now. At the record show, I've been talking to you for just a little over an hour. I still have you 15 more minutes, right? Then when the bell rings, I want to tell you about the final chapter of Ben-Hur, which, by the way, guess what? Completely disappears from the adaptation tradition. Of course it does. It is 5 years since the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Judah, Esther, there are 3 boys. Who knew? No names. Tirzah, Simonides, and Maluk, the mother has died, now reside not in the Hur palace, but in the villa that Judah inherited from Arius at the foot of Mount Vesuvius near Naples. And he is the chief financial supporter of the young Christian church just as Nero begins to persecute the new sect. One day, he already supports the church in Antioch, we learn in this last chapter. One day, when Judah is not at home, Eros shows up at the villa. She talks to Esther. It turns out that the Egyptian has had her own struggle with identity. Now destitute, the Egyptian tells Esther to tell Judah that she has learned that, quote, to be a Roman is to be a brute, and that for the much misery Messiah caused her, she slew Judah's enemy with her own pretty lady hands. Thus it was that the wily Egyptian female exacted upon the Roman Messiah the vengeance that the Jewish Ben-Hur had sought for his own. Esther responded to the declaration as Esther would, by urging Eros to stay and talk with Judah. She'll be back in a minute. She assured the woman that neither she nor Judah bore Eros any ill will and would gladly be her friend. Why? She said, we are Christians. Esther said they were neither Jews looking for vengeance or brutish Romans. They were simply Christians. Eros is having none of it. Proud and defiant to the end, Eros asks only to kiss the children of Ben-Hur before departing, quickly determined. Wallace suggests that she departed to end her miserable existence in the dark waters of the Bay of Naples. Now, Judah had not always been willing to forgive Eros for abandoning her father and allying with Messiah against Judah. After Judah defeated Messiah in the chariot race, Eros came to Judah, this is back in Antioch, came to Judah to ask him to forgive Messiah the great wager that he had just lost. When Judah heatedly refused to do so, Eros threatened to expose Ben-Hur as the man who killed Thor the Northman and the Roman centurion in Jerusalem. Judah told her, in effect, to do your best, do your worst, because, he said, for a truly princely sum, the fabulously wealthy Judah had, in effect, bought the protection of great Caesar himself. It's like a good businessman, American businessman. But after his conversion to Christianity, after the crucifixion, Judah sought to find Eros to tell her that her father, the saintly Balthazar, had died at the same time as Jesus and accompanied the Nazarene into the kingdom. He didn't find her. The Christian Judah was now eager to forgive those who had so mightily wronged him. And in the final paragraph of the novel, Wallace tells us that Judah Ben-Hur finally dedicated his great fortune to transforming the huge catacomb of San Calixto into a refuge for the persecuted Christians. You've heard the myth that they all survived in the catacombs. It is a myth. Think about it. Lew Wallace's Judah Ben-Hur becomes, in the General's Tale of the Christ, the savior of the Christian church, or at least the Roman branch of it. Some of you may remember that during one of my early lectures in this series, we spent some time talking about novels that have memorable first lines. Do you remember that? Can you remember any of them? Best of times, worst of times? Call Me Ishmael, my favorite. Also, whether I turn out to be the hero of my own life or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. What? David Copperfield. Try about this one. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Anna Karenina. Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. We notice by contrast that the beginning of Ben-Hur is by no means memorable. And we had a good laugh. But in light of this lecture, it becomes revealing because it's about detail. First sentence, it's about detail. Immediately focuses on those geographical details that we discussed about 3 hours ago. What is it? This unmemorable. The Jebel es Zebla is a mountain 50 miles and more in length, and so narrow that its tracery on the map gives it a likeness to a caterpillar crawling from the south to the north. Actually, he's got a little way with it there, okay? But let the record show that Ben-Hur has a killer concluding sentence. Let me sneak up on it by quoting the last paragraph of the novel, in which Wallace tells us that Judah spent his entire fortune on building a sanctuary for the persecuted Roman Christians in the catacombs, where the Romans buried their dead. Here's the quote, leading up to the last sentence. If any of my readers visiting Rome will make the short journey to the catacomb of San Calixto, which is more ancient than that of San Sebastiano, he can't stop with the details, he will see what became of the fortune of Ben-Hur and give him thanks. Here's your sentence. Out of that vast tomb, Christianity issued to supersede the Caesars. Not bad, Lou. Not bad at all. Thank you for your patience, folks.
One of the great treats for me is seeing how Howard can take a book I think I know and pull out all sorts of thoughts and processes and put it in a new light. He's done it with the film. He's done it with the book a couple of times. Any questions for Dr. Miller? Before he breaks the artifact? Yes.
You sort of hinted at this, but didn't quite say that he does discuss with his mother and sister going to Rome to become a soldier.
Yes.
To learn to use it against the Romans.
Absolutely. And she said that will be just fine if you use it to support your faith, whatever.
And doesn't Lou explain in the Palace of Edirne scene how we can't judge him as a Christian? Doesn't he explain that in the...
I don't remember
I
that.
seem to remember that.
Well, he wouldn't do that because he's not a Christian at that point.
Right. Says that we can't... I don't remember how to put it.
One of the things that he says in the novel, when he's talking about... I was going to bore you this with, or inflict this on you in the lecture, but I'll do it now. At one point, Lou actually addresses the issue of the relationship between his Jewish sense of ethics and what he's doing in the gladiator stuff. And he hints, he said, I did some things in training that would have been blasphemy if I did it in public. So I think that he never really engaged in the kind of thumbs up, down, that kind of stuff. But he wouldn't. He was a very wealthy man. What he was doing was relentlessly focusing on becoming the best soldier possible so he can kill Romans. And in one very poignant scene, he talks to, and I forgot who it was then. It couldn't have been Quint, maybe it was Quintus, about how he had no childhood. That he was taken immediately and sold into slavery, and when he came out, he focused everything he had on acquiring the skills to kill Romans. So he sounds like a very old man, actually, and a very tired man. But sure enough, he's only 29 years old at the end of the movie. Well, by the time if you have the 5 years since at the epilogue, he must be about 34 or 35 years old, from 17 to 34, 35 years old. One of the great things about the Stereopticon series is that you can age Judah. Not that she does. Not that she does. What else?
I was going to say Dr. Miller's going to be here for a little bit. We do have some refreshments we're putting out for you. We hope you will enjoy those and stay with us for a little bit and visit not only with Dr. Miller. We've got some things out to see. And
I want you to come and
see
this stuff.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So. Without any further ado, we will visit and mingle and talk to Dr. Miller on his own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. Come to the Magic Lantern Show. I wish I could.